Life in the ancient Near East was really nothing like ours today in the developed Western world. We do realise that, and yet there are still some aspects that we don't pick up when we read the Bible. Factors which made lives indescribably hard sometimes lie hidden between the lines. In the shortest of the four Gospels, spotting them can be even trickier. For example, does it ever strike you that the poor, regularly mentioned by Jesus, were actually also the hungry? And they weren't a minority either. Food supplies were erratic. Entire harvests could easily be destroyed by disease, extreme weather, or plagues of insects. The bread we take for granted, except during wars or pandemics maybe, was never guaranteed to the inhabitants of Roman-occupied Judea and the surrounding territories. There were no aid agencies, no food banks, no charities, no social security safety nets. Hard times could mean a constant, exhausting battle just to survive. Once you realise that, certain key stories take on entirely different complexions, like the feedings of vast crowds, posh dinner parties, even Jesus' Last Supper with his friends. There was unrest, but it wasn't just because the land was occupied. Persistent, gnawing, life-threatening hunger affects everything. I made that bread, you know, for his supper the night before. So it was unleavened bread at Passover. The Israelites had no time to prove their dough before heading out of Egypt all those hundreds of years ago. We're a remembering people, we Jews. Rituals, they're important. How else would we stay aware that our lives are in God's almighty hand? If I'm honest, I weren't too sure about letting out our upper room to the Northerners' groupies. I'd heard things. I didn't want trouble at my door, especially the Roman sort. But when he arrived, I clocked his kind, honest face. But my sister, still stick thin, was jigging up and down outside, waving her arms around like an idiot and mouthing, "It's him, he's the one." No, I didn't catch on. Always been a bit slow on the uptake. Well, I agreed the hire then, but I still wanted to know what was eating her. My sister Hannah had been with us a couple of years or so, turned up in Jerusalem right out of the blue, practically a bag of bones, lugging one of her last two remaining kiddies. Collapsed on my doorstep, too weak to speak or stagger another step. It were days till she could tell her story even. I knew life were hard up there, there'd been rumours, but it were worse than that. When the food got scarce, well, the squaddies marched in and helped themselves to half their livestock, even commandeered their donkey, and then the crops failed. So the last few sheep. Baby Theo died then, and Micah, her husband, headed into town, desperate for grain. Nothing. Massive punch-up in the marketplace. Folks were angry. The well-off and the occupiers were sitting pretty, while everyone else... Cut a long story short, well, Mike never returned. Not long after that, the holy man turned up. Oh, the tiniest glimmer of hope, she said. He had a reputation. Perhaps he could change things, give them justice, fill their bellies even. Vast crowds assembled at some remote spot. Then they sat, listening to his stories of God. The generous provider, the carer, the peacemaker, while hunger stalked growling through the ranks like some wild beast. When it got late, out of nowhere, he magicked up food at last. Words are fine, but actions, well, they speak louder, don't they? Honestly, they next to nothing, and no market on hand. How'd he do that? But along the rows, bread and fish were passed, and more bread, and more fish, and more still. Plenty to spare when everyone had had their fill. It began to make sense then, despite all their trials. God is for sharing, not fighting. For fairness, not fat cats. For folks not to be so absorbed in their own fight for survival that they could see beyond themselves and come together. Jesus' assistants gave our Hannah a food parcel out of the baskets left over. Loads there was. It just about lasted for their long trek down here. A last resort, she said, her only hope. He saved them. He saved them that day. Not just them. He threw them a lifeline. And if they hadn't been hungry, powerless, vulnerable, desperate, no amount of free picnics could have made them see what he was and who had sent him. Preparing their anniversary supper, that were the least I could do for that man and his friends. It were only bread, but he somehow then made it even more precious. How? He picked up one of the loaves I'd made. Think of this, he said, as my body. Every time you eat it, remember me. And then some wine for his blood. Physical souvenirs. They hesitated. I saw them. Well, they didn't know exactly what were coming. But afterwards, I figured he was sort of giving himself to them, everything he was, in a way they could repeat over and over. Vital nourishment to fill, strengthen, transform them. Then later, that same night, he were arrested. Before you could say dough hook, he were a goner. The others, well, the 11 leftovers, they claimed he came back. Yes, from the dead. Don't know about that myself. But he brought our Hannah and her little uns back from certain death. Bread. Jesus bread. Over and over, eating and remembering, like Passover, makes him live again. It makes him part of everyone who shares it. Even harder times were surely coming for the disciples. Times of despondency, of pain and fear and physical threats. Their souls, if not their bodies, would be crying out for some reliable sustenance with a long, even an indefinite shelf life. They might have seen Jesus doing the impossible over and over, but they wouldn't necessarily join the dots immediately between the key milestones. While the triumphant feeding of thousands would doubtless live long in their memories, it probably still took ages until they connected those events with that intimate, poignant Last Supper, when Jesus was signposting a new way out for God's oppressed, hungry, and still enslaved people. The taking, blessing, breaking and sharing of the most humble and basic of foodstuffs was a simple enough, repeatable, symbolic act that could make Jesus physically present over all the centuries to come. At face value, of course, our cherished ritual cannot neutralise hunger. But as we strive not merely to survive, but also to transform a cruel and suffering world, the unique, mystical ingredient of Jesus' own spirit within that bread promises essential food for our longest journeys.